Oh, you're right, you're okay. Nice to see you. Welcome to lesson six of our war poetry unit, our year eight English curriculum. The objectives today are to learn about a poet's background and context, to read an amazing poem, to show understanding of language, and to show understanding of structure. Now, you may notice that these objectives tend to be the same types of objective each lesson, and that's because the challenge in these lessons is not necessarily um, to do new skills. It's about consolidating and improving these same set of skills: your context understanding, your reading ability, your language awareness, your structural awareness. And the challenges each lesson will be a different poem. Ultimately, what we're building up to is an assessment task where you'll be writing about or analysing two poems, both from like the war kind of collection, and it's saying, how writers present their ideas or show their feelings or try and achieve a certain effect using language and structure. Okay, but you will need to include in the answer to that essay when we do it details about context and background. So all these sessions are all building up towards that assessment task, which will be in the near future, but I'll give you plenty of notice when it's coming. Right, let's get cracking with the today's lesson. So, background. Today's poem is by a guy called Thomas Hardy. So, uh, let's find out a little bit about him. Thomas Hardy was born in Higher Bockhampton, Dorset, England, on June 2nd, 1840. Okay. Hardy had somewhat of an isolated life in the open fields of the region. He grew up living and examining rural life, which figures prominently in many of his novels. After finishing school at 16, he started an apprenticeship to become an architect. So that's his kind of starting life, living in a very rural area. 1840s is Victorian period of history, and with the ambition or the idea of becoming an architect sometime in the future. While working on a church in Cornwall in 1870, he met Emma Gifford. She encouraged him to write from the start of their relationship, and by 1872, Thomas had given up architecture so he could devote his time to writing. They married in 1874. Over the next 11 years, Hardy wrote 5 novels. The final two, possibly two of the most famous ones, Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure, were his last long fiction works. He received a lot of criticism about the content of these books, which made him decide to stop writing novels. He wrote short stories, poems, and plays for the rest of his life. And the poem that we're going to read today was first published in 1902 and later in a collection called Times, Laughingstocks, and Other Verses in 1909. Okay, so that's the background from the poetic side of things. That's the poet's background. The context of this poem is that in 1902, Britain was at war in South Africa. The war was called the Second Boer War. It, the kind of the dates are 1899 to 1902. It's referred to as the Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War, and the South African War. The conflict was very unequal. Britain had 500 men, whereas the Boers had only 88,000. The Boers had better knowledge of the terrain, though, and could communicate more effectively. In many ways, as you see in these pictures here, the style of war that was the style of war that was seen in World War One was first tested in this conflict. Rifles, machine guns, and as you can see, you've even got trenches in some of these images here. You've got fairly large cannons, much more modern in their design. Still got some of the kind of the old-fashioned war strategies of just like having huge numbers of men going towards another enemy line. But so you can see that this kind of war, this conflict, had elements of more like the 1800s style of warfare. What was emerging was this modern technology and equipment. And you can still see though the use of horses in some of these images. Okay, so here's the poem. So I'll read it to you, and you follow it on the screen. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. But ranged as infantry, and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me, and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe. Just so, my foe, of course, he was. That's clear enough, although he thought he'd list, perhaps, off-hand like, just as I was out of work, sold his traps, no other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious, war is. You shoot a fellow down, you treat, if met, where any bar is, or help to half a crown. Okay, yeah, right, so let's go through the poem again a bit slower and making sure we understand everything. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. So, the first tricky word here in the poem is nipperkin, but that just means half a pint of beer. Okay, it's an old-fashioned uh, use of kind of measurements there. Okay. What's interesting, really, to note here at the start of the poem is the use of speech marks. You'll see that speech marks are used throughout the poem, and that gives this whole text the feeling that the speaker isn't just writing these words down. It's like the speaker or the voice of this poem is talking directly to us, having to explain what's happened in this particular conflict. You might want to think, why does this speaker want to get this out? Why does the speaker want to talk about this situation? What might that suggest about the speaker if they have this need to talk about what's happened in the war? Okay, we should move on. So the first stanza is setting up this imaginary situation where the two men who are involved in this conflict, this very personal moment in this war where the speaker of this poem shoots this other person. The speaker's imagining, well, if they'd met in other circumstances, how things would have been different. So, if they had met uh, by some ancient inn, by a nice pub somewhere, what these two guys would have done, they just sat down and got drunk together. They just had a merry time drinking beer together. That's what the speaker feels or imagines they would have done if they'd met, not on a battlefield, but in peacetime. But, and that word there just turns the whole imaginary introduction into back to reality. But Rangers infantry, so they're both in infantry. That means they are foot soldiers with rifles. Staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me and killed him in his place. So this is the two soldiers, one on each side of the battlefield. Ranged means that they are separated, but they're still quite close because infantry can get very close to each other. They are face to face. They can see each other. They both shot. I shot at him as he at me. But our speaker in this poem is the one who actually hits and killed his enemy in his place. So that's this paragraph here, sorry, this stanza here is, in many respects, this is the story. Okay? A soldier shoots another soldier in battle. But because we're looking at a poem, and this is kind of exploring ideas about war and the theme of war, and it's critical of war. We've moved forward, and Thomas Hardy doesn't just leave the story there. Thomas Hardy makes the speaker that kind of carry on talking. The speaker says, "I shot him dead because," and notice the punctuation here, a big pause, that kind of elongated dash there, just like there's a gap. I shot him dead because. And it's like the speaker has to pause and try and think, well, why did I shoot him dead? Why did I kill him? And then he justifies his actions because he was my foe. Just so, my foe. Of course he was. That's clear enough. Although, and that uh, stanza there has got this strange use of this repetition of the sound of "oh," foe, so, foe, and although. And that kind of extra rhyme and the kind of the mid-line rhyme gives this stanza almost like a silliness to it, a kind of ridiculous to the sound of it, which undermines the reasons for killing the enemy because he's the enemy. It kind of makes that whole idea of just shooting someone because they're enemy silly. You know, that's not enough reason to kill someone. That's kind of where Thomas Hardy is pushing this idea that this death was not justified, and or it is justified, but that doesn't make it right. And the repeated rhyme here just kind of makes this explanation of why the soldier killed his enemy seem a little bit silly, a little bit ridiculous. The next bit. He thought he'd list perhaps. Now we've got a few little abbreviations here. Again, we've got speech marks, keeping the idea of being a talking poem going. We'll look at this word list. List is an abbreviation or shortened version of enlist, which is where a man would volunteer to join the army. So the opposite of conscription. Conscription is where they are forced, the law is changed and men are forced to join the army. Enlist is when a man would volunteer and go and join the army off his own back. So the speaker says he thought he'd list perhaps, offhand like, just as I was out of work, had sold his traps, no other reason why. Here the speaker is considering and thinking about, well, why did this guy join the army? The man I've just shot, wonder why he was here. And he compares his situation and imagines that maybe his enemy, the man he's just shot and killed, is actually just like him. They both enrolled offhand, like they didn't really think about it. They just signed up because they had nothing better to do. As you can see, that out of work, so unemployed men would often join the army because they would get a bit of money, they would get equipment, they would get food and accommodation. So the army was a way for unemployed men to get some kind of income. Sold his traps, that just means belongings and possessions. So a sense of desperation here from the speaker that he's had to sell all his stuff, possibly to have enough money to survive. And once he's done that, the last thing he can do is join the army. No other reason why. So neither of these men in this guy's imagination have joined the army because they wanted to fight, because they wanted to kill the enemy, because they love their country. What Thomas Hardy is giving here is the idea that these men have joined the army because they're desperate, and they had no other choice as a job or to make money. Into the final stanza. Yes, kind of just affirming the thoughts that he's just had about the reasons they joined the army. Quaint and curious war is. Those two words, quaint and curious, not really typical words to describe war. In fact, they are really unlikely words to describe war. It's worth you looking those up and finding out what they mean if you're not sure what they mean. But again, they're not the typical adjectives to describe war. Yes, quaint and curious war is you shoot a fellow down. Well, yeah, that's kind of what war is, killing the enemy. You treat, if met, what any bar is, or help to half a crown. So what the speaker ends the poem saying is that war is strange because you're shooting people. The people you're shooting down, if it was peacetime, you'd help them, you'd treat them, you'd buy them a drink, or if you had it, you'd give them a bit of money to help them out. So I think what you're seeing here in this poem is an exploration of the actual act of war in terms of the personal, in kind of intimate moment where one person shoots at another person. And in normal circumstances, in peacetime circumstances, those two people would not shoot each other, would not kill each other. They would the opposite. They'd shake hands, they'd say, do you fancy a drink? Can I get you anything to eat? Do you need a bit of money? And they'd be nice and lovely to each other. But war has turned two peaceful guys with enemies who both, due to the nature of war, have to try and kill the other one. So I think it's the criticism of war, suggesting the war is unhuman, unnatural, pointless, wrong. I think that is all coming through in this poem without it being explicitly said. It's all about the kind of the inferred little meanings, and the use of the occasional bit of language like curious and quaint. But this is an anti-war poem without being massively aggressive in its tone. So here are your questions for today, Year 8. There's 5 on this slide, and then there's a few more on the next. So I'll help you through them to make sure you're on the right track. So what do the speech marks indicate about this poem? I mentioned that right at the beginning of the explanation bit. So if you want to go back over the video to check that bit out again, you can do. 2, explain what the narrator thinks would have happened if the two men had met in normal circumstances. So basically that's stanza 1. What would have happened if they'd met if it'd been peacetime? Okay, so that's this bit here. Just explain that in your own words. Number 3, how do the two men actually meet each other? Well, I think that's hopefully fairly obvious. If you want to put the quote, you can do. Stanza 2. What is the reason the narrator killed the other man? And again, the explanation is there in stanza 3. Just disappear for a minute. What does the word although suggest about the narrator's thoughts about the killing? So that's worth just pausing on this one a little bit. You know, this word although. How is that expressing very subtly the speaker's attitude to him having killed this other man? Think about the meaning of although. Think about when you use the word although in a sentence or in writing or speech. What function does the word although have, and how does that indicate the feelings and thoughts about the killing that's happened? Okay, moving on. Question 6. What does the narrator think his enemy has in common with him? So basically, what makes the two men similar? You can put that in your own words, or you can take the quotes from the stanza. And number 7, what does the narrator feel about war by the end of the poem? Okay, and again, if you're going to put a quote, you need to explain the quote. If you want to put in your own words, just put in your own words. And then you've got a bonus question. What do you think Thomas Hardy is trying to achieve in this poem? So if you've got time, you can do that extra question there. Okay, all right. Hopefully you have found this poem interesting, and there'll be some more tomorrow. Take care now, guys. See you soon.